Hello everyone, welcome to another YouTube video. Welcome to episode 2 of My Best Games. Today I'll be going through an amazing game that I played in a European Women Chess Championship in 2017. It was my very first time participating in such tournament. I did play European team championships already before that, but this was the first time I was participating in the Women Chess Championship in the individual format. So in this game, I was with the white pieces. Once again, don't worry, we'll be looking at games where I had the black pieces. I played against Elizabeta Limanovska. She's a woman FIDE master from Latvia. And yeah, let's get into the game. Let's have a look. So I played e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6. This is called the Najdorf. I played bishop e2. You have many different lines over here. I have played almost all of them, but here I played bishop e2. My opponent played e6, which turns into the Scheveningen. The Scheveningen is actually a beach in the Netherlands, just so you know, which is why I can pronounce it pretty well. But yeah, if you want to continue playing the Najdorf, you usually go with e5 over here, just so you know. I played bishop e3, bishop e7, short castle, f4. Now basically in this position you have many different setups with the white pieces. You can either go long castle or you can go short castle as I did. Usually if you want to play with f3 you want to go long castle rather than short castle, but with short castle you often go for the f4 approach. You don't want to push g4 g5 that much as it really weakens your king obviously, but usually you want to go for some f5 push, and maybe in the future you'll add some g4 g5 to that. Let's see how the game continued. My opponent played knight c6, knight b3. I avoided the exchange. My opponent played b5, which is threatening b4, and I'll be losing the pawn on e4. So that's why I defended it with a3. You can also defend the pawn by simply playing bishop d3 or bishop f3. But for some reason, I decided to play a3, you know, to have it a little bit safer. Bishop b7, bishop f3, making sure that I'm defending this pawn once again. Knight d7. So knight d7, it is a typical maneuver. It looks a little bit odd, but you usually want to go to b6 or to c5. And if you go through b6, you might want to go to c4 and look how nice the knight is on that square. You're attacking the bishop, the b2 pawn is under a huge pressure, and it's very, very inconvenient here for white. So yeah, I played knight d4. Now this looks a little weird to have my knight back on d4, because a few months ago I said that I wanted to avoid the exchange of the knights. So I went to b3 and now I went back to d4. But basically I have a feeling that I was preparing some idea that you will see in the next move. My opponent played rook c8 and I played f5. So here, supported by the knight, the pawn is under huge pressure. So yeah, I'm basically threatening to take, and if they decide to take my pawn, then I probably want to take with the knight. And yeah, it felt much better to have my knight centralized like that. But I have to admit, it's not really the best idea to waste the move like that. But okay, my opponent played knight takes d4, took the knight, bishop takes d4, and my opponent played e5, a really good move, avoiding the trade of the pawns, closing down the position in the center a little bit. And yeah, as you might see already, it's going to be really hard for me to start an attack on the king side. The pieces of black are very well defending the position, and slowly but surely black will have some sort of edge. I played bishop e3, my opponent played knight b6. As I said, the knight is going to come to c4, and it looks already a little bit unpleasant. I played queen d3. It's kind of a developing move. I want to put the rooks on d1, and maybe I keep the rook on f1, maybe I develop it to e1, maybe I support the rook and the queen on the d file and I'll put it on d1 instead. There's many options, but most importantly, I'm freeing the square on d1 for one of my rooks. My opponent played c4, however, which kind of restricts me in playing rook d1. And as this bishop is really strong on e3, I do not want to trade that for the knight. Because as you could see, this bishop on e3 is much better than my light squared bishop. The light squared bishop is kind of stuck over here looking at the e4 pawn, simply defending the pawn, and it almost looks like a pawn. It has more squares accessible than a pawn, obviously, but as you can see, it's not really a comfortable piece over here. And this bishop, on the other hand, has quite a lot of squares. It is controlling this and this diagonal basically, so this is a much more active piece and you'd want to keep it as much as possible, which is why I played bishop c1. But yeah, it looks a little odd to have my pieces still on the first rank and not really connected with each other, but that's all right. My opponent played bishop g5, wants to trade off the bishops. If I don't do anything, she will obviously take my bishop and then is able to capture that pawn. So I had to take on g5, queen takes g5, and here I played the passive but necessary move knight d1. I didn't want to allow queen e3 check if that was possible for whatever reason. Obviously this is possible, but I wasn't sure if it's any good for either of us. I have no idea. I just didn't want to trade off queens. I thought it was way too early for that. And also I'm obviously defending the pawn on b2 that was under attack. My opponent played rook fd8. I played rook f2. I don't want to trade queens once again. There was queen d2. It's not likely that my opponent is gonna play it, but I just want to make sure that it's not in the position at all. And it's in this position that my opponent made a small error. My opponent played queen e7. And it looks like a really natural move, right? You just go back, make sure that all your pieces are connected, and perhaps in the future my opponent is preparing a move like d5 that could be really interesting. However, the queen on g5 was very well placed. It was much more active than my queen on d3, and even though it looks like the queen cannot do much here, queen e7 is allowing me to do a specific move, which is f6. f6, it's a very typical move that you want to make sure that your opponent's king will be open. And fortunately, in this position, after queen takes f6, there's bishop g4. The rook will be attacking the queen as well as the bishop that will be attacking the rook. So that will be really nice for me. I'll be winning the exchange. Obviously, it's not like it's completely winning for me. My opponent has definitely some compensation for this, as my pieces are very passive, while my opponent's pieces are very active. But obviously, it's an exchange. Material is really important to have, right? I played f6, and my opponent played g takes f6, which is very logical after what we talked about. I played bishop g4. So the reason I played bishop g4 is not only am I opening up the king by playing f6, and after g takes f6, the king is in the open, I'm also making the square f5 available for my pieces. And since my bishop really wants to go to f5 to target the pawn on h7, it looks really nice, right? So yeah, my opponent played rook c5 and I played bishop f5. And as you can see, all of black pieces are a little bit on the left side from my perspective. Whereas I'm paying attention on the right side, on the king side. And as you can see, it's gonna be really hard for my opponent to defend the pawn on h7 like this. So that's why I really wanted to make use of the square f5. My opponent played bishop c8 for this reason. My opponent wants to get rid of this bishop as it's gonna be really hard to defend otherwise. I played b3, hoping that my opponent will be a little bit distracted by my move, because if the knight moves, then I'll have the square e3 available for my knight, and then I'll have another piece that wants to jump to the square on f5. So my opponent plays knight b6. Perhaps it was a good idea to take on f5. It's not really like much better, but I would say it kind of delays my idea to put the knight on f5. So yeah, my opponent played knight b6, I played queen g3 check, king h8, and I played knight e3. Look how I gave the check first, because if I would have played knight e3 immediately, then my queen wouldn't be able to give a check or go to h3 at all, at least not in the next few moves. So yeah, I played queen g3 right away, king h8, and I played knight e3, and now my queen is definitely participating in the attack. Rook g8, queen h4, I'm threatening checkmate, which is why my opponent took the bishop on f5. Knight takes f5, queen e6, rook d1, putting pressure on this pawn as well as bringing the rook in the attack. Obviously, I want to put it on h3. It's just that I have only 3 pieces here on the king side, so I definitely need more pieces for the attack. My opponent played d5, which is a very logical move, and usually this is a really good move to play in the Sicilian, because once you're able to play d5, your position will be opened, your bishops will have more air, and overall it's much better for black. However, as you can see, there are no bishops on the board. d5 is kind of late as I'm already focusing on the opponent's king, and my focus is on the king, and I'm almost checkmating my opponent. So I completely ignore this move. I play rook d3, I mind my own business, and it's in this position that my opponent played knight d7, and here I had a really cool move. If you want to take some time for this position, if you want to solve this puzzle basically, feel free to pause the video. If not, let's continue and see what move I played here. So after a little bit of calculation, I'm not sure how much time I spent on this move, honestly. I do know that I was really careful about this move. It's not an easy move to make, but I played queen takes h7. I gave away my queen just like that. I just did a Botez Gambit in an over-the-board chess tournament. But it is a Botez Gambit that actually turns into something really beautiful. Let's have a look, guys. King takes h7, rook h3, king g6, rook h6. Notice how forcing the moves are, and my opponent has only 1 square for the king available every single time. King g5, h4, king g4, knight e3, and it's in this position that my opponent resigned, because after king g3 it was rook f3 checkmate, and look how beautiful it is. Look how beautiful the checkmate is. Now obviously from this position it is really hard to like calculate this through. It's really a scary decision to make, because what if you suddenly miss a square that the king can run to, or like the pieces can help with, you know? So it was not easy to make this decision, but obviously I made sure that everything is covered, and after calculating it through, I did this. Usually you see this kind of combinations when you're doing puzzles, when you're studying tactics and so on, but this actually happened in an over-the-board game of mine, and not just in an over-the-board game, but in the European Women Chess Championship. The tournament didn't really go well for me, but I was really happy that I had such an amazing piece to remember, you know. It doesn't really happen every single game, so I'm also really grateful for my opponent to allow this amazing tactic to happen in this game. This ending, it doesn't happen every single time, so that makes it really special. So I'm really grateful for that. It is also really cool to mention that this tactic, this queen takes h7, was posted on many social media outlets. Someone even made a t-shirt with this position and sent it to me, which is really cool. And once again, I really appreciate that. It's so cool to see that this game reached a lot of people. Like, you don't expect that to happen, and it was even before I started streaming, so that just feels really cool, and I really appreciate guys a lot for that. So on that note, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video in case you love this game, and I hope to see you on the next best game of mine. Bye everyone!